I have to admit that whilst I always enjoy the challenge of alternate histories, there are some which I enjoy the topic of more than others. So I always enjoy the challenge, but the topic is sometimes what I'm less keen on. Now, in the scenario of zeros over the Mediterranean, Japan joining the Britain and the Free Powers on 20th June 1940, I found this a peculiarly attractive topic because, honestly, this is an eye of a needle which is incredibly hard to thread. But actually, it's almost viably possible, especially with the criteria of there being no second Sino-Japanese war. Suddenly, you don't have all the issues between Japan and China going on, and you don't have half the issues you have with America and Japan going on, because that hasn't sort of happened yet, or rather, the excuse for it to happen hasn't happened yet. What do I mean by excuse? Well, let's be honest. The relationship between America and Japan was terrible. It was really atrocious, and there was a timeline to a war happening. But even then, in this scenario, there is an option available because there are people who didn't think a war with America was a really sensible idea. It might be necessary to survive, but it wasn't something that should be charged into. And in fact, there were several who felt that it should be forced that America should be made to declare war, because if you could do it without them being without provoking them, and force America to act, then America will get into trouble with its own domestic population. That was the idea some were putting around. Let's be honest, the Japanese knew that whatever war happened, they couldn't fight a long war versus the Americans. The infrastructure just didn't support it, and their depth of operation didn't support it. On their own, they couldn't. Now, this is to an extent which, after the Second Sino-Japanese War, drives them into the arms of the Germans and the Italians. They're pariahs together. They are all thirsting for their own place of status. They're all thirsting for their new coming. Um, and that gives them something to work with, some common ground. But again, without the 1937 Second Sino-Japanese War starting, things become different. There are differences. And so, basically, this alternate history has one convening criteria, i.e., no Second Sino-Japanese War, and the event which it happens, therefore, because of not having that war, is that the Japanese are free and decide to join Britain in 1940. Basically, France falls, Japan decides they're going to join Britain. And I have a rationale for this, and I will be working through this rationale with you all. And it can work under those circumstances. And it can work under another circumstance which, frankly, is enabled by history itself. The very real historical scenario you have, and the personalities you have in power and in charge in Japan. It makes things interesting. It truly does. So, without much further ado, shameless book plug. Now, I am, as the title of this channel suggests, an academic. I'm a naval historian. My PhD is technically in war studies from King's College London. And there is a curious thing about academics in the UK, and I think it's pretty much the same the world over. Sadly enough, we cannot earn our promotions, nor our ability to turn from maybe a contract lecturer to a permanent lecturer, or anything like that, based on our YouTube publications. They don't count towards the research frameworks. They don't count towards that level of funding. Unless you are, I suppose, you are really famous. If you're really famous, then the university might hire you because you're really famous. But I don't think I qualify for that. I really don't. I think that's a long, long way off. So, how do you get promoted? How do you get the roles? Well, your publications, whether they're journal articles, how they are received, or books, how many of those are sold. And so, every chance I get, I plug my books. Now, soon there are going to be more coming, and so there'll be multiple books I'll be plugging. But at the moment, second edition, available from Amazon, link down below. Thank you everyone who's bought copies, hence managed to make it to the second edition. And thank you to everyone who goes and buys a copy. If you're interested in stuff about tribals, battles, and darings, destroyers, and how they came to be, in terms of the modern vessels we're dealing with today, rather than the rather large torpedo boats we were dealing with for much of the early 20th century, I think that's a good start. Certainly a good start for explaining the British strand of it. And, well, with that, let's get into the first things first of this alternate history. We have to start with the fact that there are some ships which you expect to be in the Japanese lineup which are just not available in 1940. Hosho, training carrier which could not operate latest aircraft, so that's not on the options for doing anything at this point. Akagi was modernized in 1938, is now out and is operational in 1940, so is available. Kaga is in refit till November 1940, so no one's seeing that till probably mid-1941, after the time it's worked up, etc., and got new air group and aircraft. Ryujo, refit finished in January 1940, working up to operational, so yeah, that might be available by, well, let's give that again 6 months, let's say July 1940. Soryu, in training, but available. Hiryu, working up in 1940, had only been commissioned in 1939. Okay. Shokaku class. Both vessels have been launched, but historically aren't commissioned until August-September 1941. Hio class, not even launched yet, historically in June 1941, and Taio is not even laid down yet. And let's be honest, Ryujo is also the classically very unstable carrier, which they were trying to make a carrier under 10,000 tons. It didn't work, and they ended up having to do all sorts of things with it. I don't think you'd want to take that anywhere near the Mediterranean, let alone the Atlantic. If anyone really would like to take the Ryujo on combat operations in the North Atlantic, please write it below as a comment if you really believe that's something you would want to do. But honestly, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of available carriers that I would actually take with me, you've got Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. Of those, I like Akagi, but I don't want to take it to the Mediterranean. I do not want to take that into the Mediterranean. So I'm probably, if I'm joining in the British, I'm probably going to send some ships to the Mediterranean and some ships to the North Atlantic, and I'm going to keep some ships at home just in case something happens, i.e. America does something I don't trust. This is reality at this point. So the odds are, if I'm going to deploy any ships, it's going to be Soryu and Akagi. Hiryu, Ryujo, Hosho, I keep back in Japan. Kaga, she's in refit till November 1940. I said I'm not probably going to have it available until 1941 sometime, so there's no point worrying about that. And she's too slow for pretty much anything other than the Atlantic fleet anyway, so if she is available, that's where she's going to go help. And even then, I'm not sure if the Atlantic forces will want her. They might go, she's too slow for their requirements, in which case she might stay back with the Japanese forces and free up Hiryu to go to either the Atlantic or maybe the Mediterranean at that point. So that's the reality you're probably dealing with. You're probably looking at Soryu and Akagi are all that available to go to the European and Mediterranean theatres. And one will go to the Atlantic and one will go to the Med. And as I said, my instinct is Akagi goes to the Atlantic, and Soryu goes to the Mediterranean. Simply because of the realities of operating in those scenarios, and it keeps Soryu closer to Japan. Again, okay, there's no Sino-Japanese war in the scenario, but relationship with America hasn't got any better, so I ain't gonna give that all sorts of benefits. Capital ships. Congo, Hei, Krishina, and Haruna. Well, honestly, it's a mixed bag availability for the Congos. He had just come out of reconstruction in January 1940. The other three had all completed reconstruction earlier, but at various stages of refit, training, and command transition. Honestly, you probably have about 2 of those available that you can actually send. Maybe 3. Um, I have various feelings about who ends up in Gibraltar if they head out. I have this scenario in my head where if you do get Hiryu sent with Soryu and Akagi, then one of the carriers and one of the Congos joins Force H. That would make sense to me, and the other 2 Congos and Akagi go on to the home fleet to reinforce their dealing with rapid reaction groups to deal with the potential of a German attempt to break out. Fuso and Yamashiro, they've been ignored for the last 10 years, and frankly, I don't think they'll be done anything with. I don't think they will go anywhere at all. They're gonna stay home, and they're gonna stay home. Ise and Hyuga, 1940 went for a major refit, as with the Nagatos. Historically, to get them prepared for war, Nagato Mutsu, whilst they did participate in the October 1940 Fleet Review, they spent most of 1941 having the Gaussing coils, armor, and other things they did. So again, I don't expect them to be necessarily be available quickly, but where do I think Nagato Mutsu would go? I think my instinct, considering their speed and movement, is they would end up with the home fleet. I honestly think with their 16-inch guns, that's where they'd be wanted. Yes, you might want them versus the Italians, but I have a feeling they wouldn't be ready necessarily as quickly as the carriers to get out to the theatre of operations. And as we'll be talking about Taranto, but as I've said before with Taranto, it's a cumulative thing. Add in more ships, things get interesting. And then you'll need for those large capital ships in the Mediterranean fleet goes down, but you'll need for them to deal with potentially a breakout by Bismarck and Tirpitz, and especially if Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are held back because of the presence of Congos as other fast capital ships backing up the British. Because let's be honest, a Scharnhorst versus a upgraded Congo, that's not necessarily a good fight for a Scharnhorst. They do have some advantages. And yeah, Congos are battle cruiser, one word. And I'll talk more about the Spectrum in a bit, but then they have moved, I would say they've crossed the line to being fast battleships in many of their conversions, not necessarily all their conversions, and I know they're still treated as battle cruisers by the Japanese, and that's especially how they approach them, but I'd say they've crossed the line. I would also, I would say that the scenarios you're looking at, more carriers, etc., Scharnhorst and Gneisenau probably don't go out on their operation alone. And if they don't do that, then they're held back for Bismarck. And that can mean you decide I would prefer to have a far greater fleet available. So, yeah, I'd say Nagato Mutsu head towards the home fleet to support there. And Yamato Musashi, they're not launched till 1940. August and November 1940 precisely. And not commissioned until December 1941 and August 1942. So they are a long way off. Realistically, therefore, you're going to get two Nagatos turning up probably. If you made a decision to join in June, you're probably looking at late October, early November. They'll be heading out, and 2 to 3 Congos, probably 2, maybe 3. But yeah, probably 2, and probably 2 carriers. So it's not a massive force coming to Europe by any stretch of the imagination. They don't have a massive force available, and they've got to keep the stuff back for their own home defense. I wouldn't be surprised if cruisers and destroyers get deployed as well with those forces and built around them, and that's going to depend again on availability, what's actually available. And when you boil down into those numbers, many of the bigger cruisers, many of the more powerful destroyers are not quite available this period. But also expect some of the cruisers to be deployed on counter-surface raid duties and all those things. So they're not going to be deploying a massive fleet. They're not going to be taking over for the Mediterranean fleet. They're not going to be replacing Admiral Cunningham. They are going to be deploying forces in sufficient strength that they take an admiral with them. That's going to be a standard. And they are going to be slotting into the command structure. It's going to be interesting seeing how they manage to work out communications and coordination of forces, but it's not impossible. It's not something that hasn't been considered. And whilst, yes, in January 1939, the British and Japanese were pointing guns at each other, and even in January 1940, there is the Asamamaru incident. Even with all that in place, if this is decided to go through, it will be worked up. It's not going to be easy, but it's not impossible. And the question is, what happens if the Zeros are over the Mediterranean and side of the Allies? So we have to imagine that the needle managed to be threaded. And they have an advantage, because there is a Prime Minister. Prime Minister is Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. He is special. He is connected with a capital C. He is respected with a capital R. To an extent, he is the only admiral I can think of who never had an assassination attempt. There was a massive incident in Korea, but he managed to put that down pretty much by force of personality alone. He's known to be respected and honoured by the Emperor. He is known to be respected and honoured by a lot of the Buddhist groups, and even the army doesn't try and push him. Now, historically, he doesn't stay long as Prime Minister. Politics is not necessarily his first choice, and there are others pushing for the role. But again, no one tries to get rid of him by killing him to get him out of it. You could say, in other scenarios, you could go, oh, well, that's because, he's not worth killing. Considering how many admirals and senior officers of the Japanese Navy and Army are killed in the 1920s and 30s, let alone politicians, the bar on how useless you have to be justified killing is pretty darn low. How useless you have to be to justify not killing. And he's not that. We know he's not that. Because of what he does achieve, and because of the service he renders. And because after World War II, he's the guy called back to get the Navy to surrender. He's literally the only one the Emperor can trust with the task of making sure the Army and the Navy do what they've been signed up to do. And he's powerful enough and influential enough to do it. And then to sow the seeds for what will become the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and other things. So, if he's not so useless that he doesn't justify him being killed, and I've said the bar for that would have to be very low, he's the other thing. He's good enough and capable enough and useful enough and influential enough that no one wants to go for him, because he crosses and has feet in too many camps and too many alliances. And here's an interesting thing. If he is not in power with the Sino-Japanese war going on, he's got that freedom. He opposed war with America because he thought Japan couldn't win it. He didn't see the point in it. He thought it was silly to go for it. Well then, he has another option. You see, prior they have to join Germany, Italy, and these powers who can't really help them. But if they join Britain, if they join alliance with Britain in this war, then they have a reason to build up their forces. They have access to resources. They'll be connected into the British Empire. It'll be the old alliance again. And it will be useful for the British, so they're not going to stop it. It will be useful for the Japanese. Because suddenly all those problems they might have had stop being the case. They have access to all sorts of things. It's also a way of turning the strategic situation on the Americans. Because he joins the war alongside the British and the Allies, and suddenly, no matter what America feels like, do they want to join the war? Do they want to join Germany and Italy in the war against Britain, etc.? Because if they provoke a war with Japan, that's what they get. Because they're fighting on the side. That's not going to happen, and that's not what they want. In fact, if this goes to plan, he might find himself allied with the Americans, which is going to provide him with time. Time is necessary for sorting out his own house, for sorting out his own people. Time is necessary for sorting out the relationship with the Americans, i.e., that can be potentially done. And time, as allies again with the British, could provide him with the necessary interlocutors to do so, to build those connections and buy a version of peace on terms he can accept. Who knows? It might even get Japan some empire from Italy. After all, post-World War I, they got some islands off Germany. And Tsingtao itself in China. Maybe this time they get parts of Italian Africa. There are advantages he can sell. There are words he can push. And I think the phrase comes that he would announce something along the lines of honouring our traditional alliance with our traditional friends. That under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, we were forced to leave. Under the terms of the London Naval Treaty, we could not renew. Under the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty, we decided to avoid, not sign, because we can no longer consider it suited to our needs, because we saw war coming. We didn't believe peace had a chance. We now will join the war on the side of our friends, on our traditional ally, Britain. We will fight alongside them in their hour of need, because we are a great power, and great powers stand up for democracy. I know, Japan is not. But the phrase would be, it's the emperor and the king standing up for democracy. That sort of, our fellow royal, our fellow monarch, our fellow island. And yeah, you can get the emperor involved to an extent. It's going to be difficult. You don't want to get the emperor involved too much in politics. But the emperor, on many occasions, did back up Yonai. He was prepared to back up Yonai. That was one of the reasons why Yonai is not touched. Because there are people you do not mess with. In Japan, even in this period. Yonai is one of them, because of who he's connected to. So he announces this, and announces he's going to be sending the fleet to support the British. And probably selects a certain army general and says, you will command and ready a corps to go to fight in North Africa and wherever is needed. You are going to lead the creme de la creme of our army to glorious victory over the Germans and the Italians. Going to be a few British generals going, okay. So, that's it pretty much. It's a case of they are declaring war to avoid war, basically. It's the absence of the Second Sino-Japanese War. It gives them an option. It gives them probably the only option to avoid war with America under this circumstance. War alongside Britain. Because America is not going to want to aid Nazi Germany and Italy. And fascist Italy. They're just not keen on that one. And they kind of side arse on democracy, and you kind of catch Roosevelt and a lot of the American political leadership in a catch-22. If they cause trouble for Japan, they're causing trouble for Britain. If they try and tell Britain not to accept Japan as an ally at this point, when they're not prepared to go and fight themselves, they'll probably get ignored and look weak, and then they might paint themselves into an even tighter corner. There's all sorts of issues here. Now, it does cause potential problems for America later on joining the war, but those can be solved by other scenarios. And they're probably still going to keep up their factories and supplying goods and building their own ships. So, honestly, they're going to keep up their preparations, they're going to keep up with their constructions, but they might even get a new partner, because they might decide to sell equipment to the Japanese. Or alternatively, the Japanese decide to buy it from them. Remember, the Japanese haven't had the combat experience of the Second Sino-Japanese War. They're probably not that dissimilar to their historical development of carriers and aviation and capabilities. But they are now going to get experience of the Mediterranean and the European theater. And that's going to be interesting. Now, what I haven't mentioned is the deployment of bombers. And honestly, the Japanese bomber force is closer to that of the German and Italian bomber strength in terms of its shape and format than the British and American with their heavy bomber forces. Their massed heavy bomber forces, which they are oriented around. But I could well see them deploying some significant aviation assets. It would take time, though. Ships will probably arrive first, because they're self-contained assets you can deploy. And then you can send a store ship along with them. But they can turn up with their own accommodation, their own food, their own machinists and systems to try and to maintain them. You need to supply them ammunition, you need to supply them with fuel and etc. But the British can sort of sort out quite a lot of the fuel issues. Now, in terms of deploying aircraft, in terms of deploying land power, that's more complicated. You have to set up bases, supply chains, all sorts of things. But again, the easiest access for them to area for them to deploy aircraft and troops and aircraft and troops to, is going to be North Africa, and that's going to be a bad time for Germany and Italy at this point. The place they really don't want to see is a whole load of extra forces turning up in North Africa with an unfettered supply chain. A supply chain which is not interdicted in any way, shape or form. And also, you have to remember that also will clear up immediately the forces which historically were fighting in Burma, although the Indian Army, all those forces no longer have that trouble, and any possibility of a Indian famine getting as bad as it did. It possibly still happens, because there's still going to be failure crops, but it's probably going to, you'll be able to more easily move merchant ships around without them getting sunk in the ocean, so the fewer merchant ships can keep the slack going far better. But also, you will be able to hire merchant ships from the other direction, so you might be able to hire American merchant ships or Japanese merchant ships to firm the gaps. And of course, that's the problem when you have a system which depends upon shipping to move stuff. If you don't have enough ships because you're losing ships, and you can't hire more ships because all the ships are being used for things like the Battle Atlantic, etc., when you suddenly find yourself needing extra ships to move goods because you don't have the freight lines and other infrastructure put in place because of poor management long term, and let's be honest, the famines and the issues are a long term scenario. Right? When people blame Churchill, I always suggest they point out they are actually blaming him as Prime Minister is the wrong thing. Blaming him as Chancellor of the Exchequer not investing in the infrastructure in India about 20 years previously, then you've got a case you can make. But it's not so much a decision made at a time, it's a I don't want to spend money 20 years earlier than it is a decision later. That's the scenario. It's one of those interesting things when people try sort of blaming him in the wartime and go, no, that's not fitting with the scenario or the circumstances or the actual evidence. But you can actually blame him about 20 years ago when there's a proposal brought to him for funding some improvements to the lines and railways in India, and he says it's a colonial issue and the colonial government has to make the decision and has to fund it, and they say, we don't have the money. So, it's... the joys of history. It's so much fun. So let's see, what's Britain's reaction going to be? Well, Churchill is an interesting soul, he really is. However, I cannot see him being disappointed by this turn of events. He's probably going to be ultimately quite happy. He's also going to be worried about how he's going to manage America's reaction to it, and he's going to be worried about how he's going to integrate the Japanese forces. He's also going to wonder what the Japanese want from this. But he's also smart enough to probably work it out. What Japan is looking for is time. Time to build themselves up. Time to strengthen themselves. The ability to learn from war, improve and hone their blades in preparation for a potential future conflict. Or maybe to avert a future conflict because they managed to secure the world being divided up into thirds, which is their sort of rough plan of what they would like the world to be shaped like in terms of spheres of influence. He is definitely smart enough to figure that one out. He is not necessarily one of the most knowledgeable of the Japanese or understanding of the Japanese of the British political class, but he's also not as dumb as some. The British have a curious scenario when it comes to Japan. You can run the gamut from incredibly well informed to incredibly uninformed, walking from one office to another. So like most countries then. But it's almost to an extent of the uninformed runs from the Japan is a mystical nation which we don't understand on the other side of the world to Japan owes everything to copying everyone else. Both are completely uninformed and completely incorrect. So what's Britain's reaction, broadly speaking, going to be? Honestly, as said, excitement, happiness, this is going to be useful, but he's also going to have to work out how he's going to play it. How is he going to present it to the American public, because he doesn't want to have backlash there. How he is going to present it to the British public, Parliament, they're all going to be happy, and allies coming to help them out. And how he's going to work with the Japanese forces, and how he's going to start interfacing with them, because they're a long way away. I wouldn't be surprised if the first thing that happens is potentially an invitation to Cairo or Alexandria, to Yonai, for Churchill and him to have a meeting. I would also not be surprised if on the invitation are not only the leaders of the various free nations who are still allied with Britain after the fall of France, but a senior American representative. Do things above board. Make sure the Americans know what's going on within the realms of it's useful for you to know, for them to know what's going on. But also, it's going to be a case of we want to try and entice the Americans into this broader alliance. We don't want them to feel excluded from it. So Churchill will be given a very, very complicated tightrope to wander. And I did use that phrase. Not tightrope to cross, tightrope to wander. Because it's not going to be a tightrope which goes in a straight line. It is going to be one which is both tight, as in you are walking on a very, very fine, fine rope and balancing on it, but it is going to meander, just to be more complicated. It's going to go nowhere in straight lines. I think he can do it, though. I think if anyone has a chance of doing it of the leaders at this point, it's probably Churchill. That's not necessarily a glowing reference. I've discussed many times the realities are that once you get down to it, when you're looking at the fact that it has to be a conservative because of their seats they have in Parliament, and then it has to be someone pretty darn famous to get the support of the country at this time, and it has to be someone with the right level of experience and mental acuity. You can spin those 2 points around if you want, but either way, it shortens it down to roughly 3 or 4 candidates, and Halifax and Churchill are the ones in the room when Chamberlain asks the question. And Halifax blows it by saying he'd serve under Churchill. And Churchill keeps his nerve and keeps quiet. It's a test of faith, you could say, but also it's a test of patience. And Halifax fails it. Churchill, Prime Minister. France has fallen, but now he's got Japan. So, in naval terms, he's exchanged a rank 3 power for a rank 2 power. Not necessarily a bad thing. I will add this in as well. I do not think that the Japanese are going to magically get there in time for Mirza Kabir or anything like that, so those events are unlikely to be changed. Potentially the context changes it for the French. Potentially. Potentially, when you're setting up the Free French, there are some parts of their colonies thinking, hang on, if we're at war with if we don't sign on to this, the Japanese might well just take us over as we're almost, they might never hand us back to France, so better go Free French. There's all sorts of options which may happen. But it's going to be an interesting one to see what they do. Allies' reaction. Well, the two major ones you have to consider are Australia and New Zealand. John Curtin and Peter Fraser. Canada had often downplayed the risk from Japan as a potential adversary in order to downplay the need for rearmament in case that upset America, because they didn't want to have another invasion scenario from the Americans, because, let's be honest, most of the Canadian population is on the board of America, and whilst I think they felt fairly confident in the 1920s and 30s that they had a good chance of beating the American army as it was then, and let's be honest, the Canadian army is known throughout history of being incredibly inventive when fighting wars if you give them more than 5 minutes. So, yeah, we'll give them half a dozen, 1/6 of the other on that one. But Australia and New Zealand, John Curtin, Peter Fraser, those countries had traditionally been worried about Japan. In fact, Curtin and Fraser had both been incredibly worried about Japan and had secured, very special privileges about their forces and deployment of their forces because of their fear of Japan. At this point, this frees up their forces. Yes, they're wanting to keep some at home for home security, defense, and those sort of things. But suddenly you've freed up a large number of Australian and New Zealand assets and capabilities to move into the Mediterranean. So these forces will also probably deploy more into the Mediterranean and North Africa. There'll be entire formations of soldiers, etc., which will head that way. And don't expect things like the Canadian Brigade to reinforce Hong Kong. You don't need that in this scenario. You don't need any of the reinforcements of Singapore, Malaya, etc. to happen. Those troops are all free to go to North Africa. Or eventually to Europe. That changes things. That changes the quantities of Empire forces available. And also changes some of the other scenarios you've got, but we'll get into that. I think these two nations will be pretty darn happy with this result. They will not trust it completely. They'll want to keep some forces back, and they'll want to keep an eye on the Japanese. And as said already, I don't think the Japanese deploy everything by any stretch of the imagination, so they'll be justified in that, but they will feel a lot more secure in this war effort. Especially once Japanese forces are actually deployed fighting in the combat, because then there's a scenario if you can't easily withdraw those forces suddenly from combat. And finally, well, not finally, but finally amongst the, I would say, Western powers in this scenario, or the Anglosphere, if we want to be quite brutal on it, you have the American reaction. Now this is going to be the most interesting. Now, initially I thought, well, my first reaction when I was looking at this and doing research on this was going to be, America is going to sit there and go, we don't want to get involved in this. We don't want to get involved in this war. We're just going to keep on supplying. We're going to keep writing treks, with the British having the Malay, Sterling area, etc. going well and doing all its finances great. That's going to help Britain pop up and pay the bills. So that's going to help Britain keep its economy going and deal with the costs of the war. Also, with the relationship with Japan, that might also be interesting, because that's a market for a lot of raw resources and raw materials, which the British Empire has a lot of to chug up. And, you know, there are options there. And also, it's similar in terms of it gives you a supply line for, let's say, your goods coming from America. Well, if they come from the west coast of America, sail across the Pacific, and across the Indian Ocean, they can be in North Africa and reinforce your forces there. Yes, it's not as quick as crossing the Atlantic, but it's gonna. If there's no war in the Pacific, it's gonna be a lot safer. You won't need to escort the merchants. You can have the merchants sailing as they traditionally do. You only need to worry about convoys at this point now, in the North Atlantic, South Atlantic to an extent, and anything you're doing in the Mediterranean. So it's made everything easier from that perspective, but for the British. But all this also has a knock-on effect on the Americans. So the Americans can stand there and just be supplying goods, but if Japan has really emphasized, and Britain's emphasized, that this is a great power alliance to defend democracy, to defend the world against dictatorships and tyranny, and I know the truth of the matter, please note I do know, but I could also see Japan happily spinning this line. The monarchies, the traditional monocracies, or whatever you want to call the various variations on the systems they have, standing up and defending the free world from the dictatorships. Now, I don't think that necessarily gives Roosevelt the ability to join the war straight away. But I think there are going to be three very interesting camps in America that are going to be pushing for a closer integration in the war. There's going to be the camp which are worried about an Anglo-Japanese alliance reforging itself. That Japan, linked into the British Empire, becomes something they cannot manage. Remember, as I've talked about in many videos, the true problem for the British and the Americans in the Far East was if either of them beat up Japan solo, or then the other would lose their eminence and status. So neither could allow the other one to solo Japan. Well, neither can also really allow the other to ally with Japan without getting themselves involved on a strategic level. So there is going to be that faction. There is going to be the faction who do not like the embarrassment of America, the great beacon of democracy, sitting back while these others defend democracy. The great nation of America doing nothing. There's always pride at stake. And then there's going to be the faction who just don't like the fascists or are pro-Britain. They're going to be interested in this and wanting to join. Now, on the other side, you're going to have the ones who don't want to join a war, are fundamentally isolationist, etc. But the trouble is, the isolationists divide into two camps. The smaller camp is the pure isolationists. They are a very small group within the actual elected political officials. The larger group of isolationists are the ones who are isolationist only as far as Europe goes. If it's the Far East, if it's the Americas, they're not isolationists, they're getting involved. That's how he votes through gets the reactions through to the Sino-Japanese War, etc. All these things. Thanks to that group. That group is by far one of the largest political factions. And that group I could see ending up coming around to the perspective of, we don't want an Anglo-Japanese alliance to form up. The easiest way to prevent an Anglo-Japanese alliance is if we join in as well and turn it into an Anglo-American-Japanese alliance. Or an American Anglo-Japanese alliance. We don't really care. That is going to take time to work through, though. So, theoretically, that could be over very quickly, especially if Roosevelt pushes through and just goes, this will be a naval war, we will deploy only naval forces, no ground troops. He could theoretically get that through and get ships in the Mediterranean home fleet by end of October, beginning November. Which, if you think about it, it's quick, but it's not massively quick. We're talking 4 or 5 months. The odds are it takes longer for it to percolate through, and we're talking about a year, but I'm going to from now on point out what could necessarily happen if they happen quicker. But I think, again, America gets involved. They might have to manufacture an incident. And by manufacture, there are all sorts of people who do conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor, etc. No, that was just stupidity. That was pure and utter stupidity and arrogance. The positioning of forces there, not preparing Pearl Harbor properly, not giving the commanders the access to information that the previous commanders have been using to say they were in the wrong position, all those things. That is stupidity and arrogance on the part of this man and those around him, who believe that no one would attack them. But if you keep pushing the neutrality patrols in the Atlantic further and further east, if you keep pushing them further and further east, eventually you're going to force the Germans to either do something stupid or to declare war. Which is also stupid, but it's on a scale of stupid which is beyond just doing something stupid. And the thing is, he's already been pushing those neutrality patrols further and further. So, again, that's not a difficult option for him. That's going to be the longer term option. Shorter term option is, we cannot politically afford to be out of this. Ground troops, it's a difficult thing. Marines and Navy, he might well be able to deploy those. And have to work on the rest. It's going to be a fudged compromise. Now, the other option, of course, I haven't really discussed much is, of course, he could, just decide to join the Germans and Italians to fight the Japanese. I don't see that happening under any circumstance, not with Roosevelt. There is no way he likes them enough he dislikes the Japanese enough to do that. And in this circumstance, without the second Sino-Japanese War on, and without having had the rev up against the Japanese that had necessarily brought about, so you've just got the traditional animosity between the two nations rather than more recent aggression. This actually might have him in a better position to do the whole alliance thing. But it is going to be another tightrope for him to traverse. It truly is. And that is the point. This is definitely threading a very, 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 very tight eye of the needle. And all three of the major leaders involved are going to have an absolutely gargantuan task ahead of them. Now, the fascisty powers, how will they respond? Well, if they have any sense, both will be saying something along the lines of fudgesicle at this point. And I mean, most sincerely, fudgesicle. Absolute, complete and utter, total fudgesicle. This is the worst thing they could do and the worst situation they could find themselves in. So, why have they found themselves in it? What has brought this upon them? Traditionally, this is the point at which Hitler does try and make some overtures to Britain about peace. With Japan joining the war, those overtures might be slightly different. They might be slightly more concerned and desperate. He has got Norway at this point. He has got Norway, so he's still got that access, and he's got France. But, and this is the big but of this whole equation, he's got ambitions for the Soviet Union, and he's got a scenario of Italy. Italy is not as secure a dictatorship as Germany is. Italy gets rid of its fascist dictator. Historically, when some troops touch down, Italy switches sides. Now, the thing is, that's based on some early victories and some early successes which have kept them in the war. With Japan reinforcing the Mediterranean fleet and reinforcing the home fleet, surface forces' abilities for action is going to be much more limited. They are now facing the largest naval conflagration of concentration of firepower they could potentially face, and the British are able to really maximise their deployment of assets to the areas of conflict and not have to have an Eastern Fleet or have any forces that are beyond those needed for maritime security and policing in the Far East and other areas. And they're going to be getting reinforcement of critical units from the Japanese. Thinking about this on a strategic level, if I'm Germany and Italy, I start to seriously think about what I need to do in this war. How do I win? If I was Italy, I'd be making my aim has got to be to block the Suez Canal. If I can reach Alexandria, and that's always their aim, if I can get to Alexandria, I can block the Japanese coming through. If I can control the Suez, I can stop the Japanese coming through. And yes, they can still come from Gibraltar, but that's a far less sustainable route. Coming from the Indian Ocean, etc., they literally have a peaceful voyage. There's no ability to attrit the whole way across. And also, again, this is effectively turned, despite the few forces the Italy does still have in the Indian Ocean, etc., in this period, they are mostly heading back to Italy. But you have this scenario, this very strong scenario, that now you've turned the Indian Ocean into a safe holding area for the British. They can move things like capital ships, etc., and assets down the Suez Canal when they don't need them at Alexandria. That's going to make it more difficult for frogmen, etc., to reach them. It might make it also easier to predict when they're coming out, etc. And there's reasons they don't do it during the war because of the various the scenarios of the operations. But this is a different scenario here. The Indian Ocean is not even a potential war zone now; it's a peace zone. And that's before you get things like maybe the British bringing in concentrating assets like floating docks in that area. There's all sorts of things you can bring from, let's say, from Singapore, etc. You can bring infrastructure that you have that's mobile infrastructure that you can literally bring and concentrate. Now you don't need to potentially support forces in the Far East. And that's the British. The Japanese have their own infrastructure, which they can potentially bring with them and set up. So honestly, their reactions to the fascist powers, I expect to be bad. I expect them to be stormy. I expect them to be angry. But what can they ultimately do about it? Fudge all. Frigating fudge nothing. It's June 1940. You haven't yet reached in anywhere near the peaks of German U-boat strength. You've got, in terms of the war in the Mediterranean, the Greco-Italian War hasn't yet kicked off. That doesn't start till October 1940. The North Africa campaign, if we consider the Africa Corps only deployed, of course, in February 1941. All these things mean that it's a very different Mediterranean, and you're about to have it made very, very even more different. So I think the first reaction is going to be anger, then it's going to be bellicose bluster, and then it's going to be nothing because they can do nothing. I don't think either's really smart enough about a strategic situation to feel fear. Maybe Mussolini. But I don't think Hitler will, because Hitler will brush it off again as the Japanese coming, and, what are they going to do? What are they going to bring? Which lets us to what is likely to happen next. And believe it or not, I'm going to get to Stalin. But as I'm alive, that slide comes after this one, because I think Stalin is going to be the slowest to react out of all this scenario. Especially as probably, but quite potentially, the Russo-Japanese, the Soviet-Japanese War of 1939 has still happened. Honestly, I could see that having still happened, definitely. And that would have still therefore been a key factor in when he invaded Poland. So yeah, this is an interesting scenario for him. This could cause him an issue. And this basically is a larger talk through of what is likely to happen next. And again, this time I've just literally listed what is actually available, not what is traditionally talked about, but what is actually available. And as you can see, I focus in again. Realistically available at this point, we're talking Akagi Soryu. No one wants to take Ryujo, and no one wants to take Hosho to the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. They really don't. Capital ships, you've got the Kongo, Hei, Kirishima, and Haruna. Hei, probably not available. Let's be honest, she's just come out of reconstruction in January 1940. She's still working up. So you're probably not going to see her available till I would say July, August 1940. I'm giving them 6 months to work up and be happy with them, and I think that means that you've probably got Kongo, Kuroshima, and Haruna as your deployments, and I wouldn't be surprised if Haruna goes to Force H, and Kongo and Kuroshima go to the UK. The UK. I have this feeling that Hay, when she's fully available, probably doesn't end up with Force H. She probably ends up going to the home fleet because, again, having those 3 fast capital ships there will be really, really helpful. And again, it's Nagata Mutsu, and they're going to take a few months to be prepped, so they're not going to be available till 1941. So I reckon it's important for them to have the Congos in the Atlantic because the Japanese are going to want the honour of fighting the Germans. They missed out on that in World War One. Now, you could say, well, sure they want the honour of fighting the Italians and the Torios. Let's consider the perception post-war. As I've often mentioned, the Torios and the Italian battle fleet is far stronger, far more capable than the German fleet is. Their surface fleet is always more capable. They're always a more balanced navy. They're always a more flexible navy than the Kriegsmarine. They truly are. They are a far better sustained formation than the Kriegsmarine, especially as they didn't have the effect of the Treaty of Versailles. Yes, they had the Washington and First London treaties, but they weren't part of the Second London Treaty, and they've had a lot of investment, and they've been able to grow, and they've got the Littorios in, they have more battleships available than at any one time than Germany has actually in service in the entire war. The Germans have Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck, Tirpitz, of which usually only 2 of those are available at any one time. Because, let's be honest, by the time Tirpitz is available, Bismarck has been sunk, and Gneisenau is pretty much in refit. And when you look at most of the scenario, they usually have about 2 available. Sometimes it's theoretically 3, but then you've got others in deep refit. So, saying all that, if we compare it to the Italians, they have Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, they have Guglielcestre, her sister, 2 other older converted, upgraded battleships. They usually have 6 to draw from, and they usually have 3 or 4 of those available for operations. Yes, fuel often limits that more, and certain Allied actions, but in this period, in 1940, they have all 6 ready and raring to go. That's not something to discount, and this is 1940. Plus, in the Mediterranean, you are never operating under a free sky. You're always operating under a neutral at best, actively hostile at worst. But saying all that, if we look at the history, everything concentrates on the German ships. Everything concentrates on the fight with the Bismarck. Everything concentrates on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, on Tirpitz. You don't hear that much about the Littorios. Why? Because it's a status thing, honestly. It's a narrative thing. And the Japanese, the British will want an aircraft carrier for the Mediterranean. But they've got enough capital ships for the Queen Elizabeths out there to deal with to do the job they want to do. What they don't have is enough fast capital ships to do the fast fleet operations in the home fleet and to back up Force H. Force H usually has Renown. And in this scenario, we're saying, well, they're going to have Renown, probably, and Haruna. I really do think it's going to be Haruna. If they have Renown and Haruna, that's a pretty good pair with our HMS Ark Royal. And if they are eventually joined by Hiryu, that's a very good set of force. Let's be honest, Force H has just become a nightmare for anyone to try and engage, and a very, very, very picturesque force to look at. I mean, I wouldn't mind looking at that picture of that force. I'm just saying, if anyone wants to digitally recreate such a force of Haruna, Renown, and Hiryu and Ark Royal in their late 1940 conditions, I'm just saying, I think everyone would quite like it. And you've got to have Sheffield, a town class cruiser, and probably a reciprocal cruiser from the Japanese, and probably equal numbers of destroyers. And yeah, Force H becomes a really sexy force. Also, one which, let's be honest, most of the Axis forces would be avoiding with a well, they wouldn't want to get close enough to have a 30-foot barge pole in their range, let alone a 10-foot one. So what's the Soviet reaction going to be? He's going to wish he had a navy. That's what he's going to wish. He's going to wish he had a naval force capable of deploying. Why am I saying he's going to wish he had his navy in service? Because he's now got a naval noose going on. The navies are starting to combine. Britain and Japan, let's be honest, Japan's the power he was just fighting a war with. Britain is a old enemy. Basically, if you look at some of the Soviet literature, you'd almost believe Britain is the bogeyman behind every single great threat they've ever received. That Britain is always, even today, in some of the stuff which comes out from Russia, you would honestly think Britain runs the world. And we wouldn't object to that, but we don't anymore. I'm sorry, we don't. We just don't. So, what's he going to do? Well, again, he's got a problem. He has a choice. Does he break his alliance with Germany and join Britain and Japan? Does he decide to firm up the alliance with Germany and decide to declare war against Japan and Britain alongside Germany and Italy? Or does he try and stay neutral and see where the wind blows? I don't see Stalin as a precipitous personality. He is many things, but he is not a precipitous personality. He is certainly capable of precipitous action, but is not a precipitous personality. With that in mind, and that being the key point here, I think he does the whole wait and see scenario. Which, to be honest, plays into the Allies' hands, because that means definitely Hitler's probably going to try and launch a ground invasion of him. And, let's be honest, if he doesn't have to commit the Africa Corps or the invasions of Greece, and perhaps not even Yugoslavia, depending on how the situation works out, he might do it earlier, but he also might not. Yes, he's won versus France and Norway, but the strategic situation could change, and if it changes enough, then Hitler might be forced to change his plans. Might be. Or rather, potentially should be forced to change his plans, but might not because, well, it's Hitler and his command staff. And I know I keep emphasizing Hitler and using him as shorthand for his for the strategic leadership going on in Germany at this point, but let's be honest, he is not the one coming up with the plans. He sets out his vision. Others write the plans and come up with them. So whenever people start to sort of really blame him, you can say, yes, he's set the wrong vision, but you're supposed to accomplish the plan and advise. And if you're failing to advise, then that's as much on you as it is on the person failing to take your advice. That's your job when you're a general or an admiral. You are paid the big bucks because you have the experience and the capability to do this. So, let's start off with the Mediterranean. And first things first here, and it's worthwhile considering, What's the Mediterranean going to be like with free carriers? Well, the quickest way to integrate the Soryu is going to be operating in pairs, which is the base of most operations. Now, operating in pairs, I would say this means that Eagle goes through maintenance. She gets her maintenance, because the pair you're probably going to take is Illustrious and Soryu, if you're operating together. What do you get with that sort of scenario working together and working up? Well, you have a strike carrier. It is kind of like a victorious Saratoga scenario, or, sorry, USS Robin and Saratoga scenario, where you have a carrier which is orientated around fighting battles, and a carrier which is orientated around launching strikes. And you go, well, you take the daytime strike role, and we'll take the organizing fighters role and the air defense role, and slowly start to integrate the forces. I think it could be very interesting to try and integrate Zeros into this, and this is where things become interesting, because there are going to be some interesting aircraft available. With free carriers to pool the needs of the Mediterranean fleet, and probably extra destroyers and some extra cruisers added in, you're going to have a very different scenario start to emerge. When you have only two carriers, you always have to take both carriers with you, and as said, you don't in this scenario because you've got three carriers, so you can leave one behind, and as said, that means Eagle can be maintained, but also means Soryu and Illustrious can also all be maintained. They can all be maintained far better. Furthermore, with the store supply coming in, etc., and the fighters from Soryu, you are not going to have as much burden placed on the Fulmars, which is going to help maintain their numbers and their operating capability. Finally, without needing to send the resources to the Far East to reinforce Australia and Singapore and all those things when they are over 1940 and through 1941, well, those resources can now head to North Africa. They can now head to Alexandria to sustain a navy. So this makes all those scenarios that little bit easier. I could honestly see a scenario where maybe even Japanese aircraft end up operating for British ships. But I don't think that's going to happen very quickly. I don't think the Royal Navy is suddenly going to go, right then, we're going to buy Zeros right now to make up our fighter numbers. No. They've already in negotiations with the Americans, but there is a scenario there for you, because again, the supplies from the Americans, if you want to get American equipment, well, if you want to bring it to North Africa, you can bring it, as said earlier, across the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, and never have to touch the Atlantic, never have to touch the submarine convoy routes. So A, you can run those ships far more regularly, you're not waiting for convoys, and B, and this is a critical scenario, those ships are unlikely to be intercepted in any way, shape or form, which means you get the ships across. Now, yes, I still expect German merchant surface raiders to be operating in this area and doing the things they do historically. But again, you're going to have Japanese assets and British and the British Empire assets, Dominion and Commonwealth assets, all providing some form of security. Maybe you convoy, but if you're convoying, perhaps you're using old cruisers as the convoys. So you might find a whole load of the C's and the D-class cruisers and the E's start turning up and running convoy routes where they think there is an actual enemy, actual threat. You might also have Japanese maritime patrol aircraft reinforcing certain positions around the Indian Ocean, around this sort of scenario. And why are the Japanese going to be happy to be slotting in? The same reason they were so happy to slot in during World War I. A, what they think they're going to get out of it, and B, it's also going to enable them to work out to find out what's going on there. Remember, a lot of the Japanese assessment of the British Empire is based on their experience of assisting with certain sections of the British Empire during World War I. It's not without historical precedence or without a healthy dose of scenario. But the most interesting thing comes with Taranto in November 1940. Now, I would say that if you announce in June 1940, the earliest you are going to get ships arriving with the Mediterranean fleet is probably going to be, I'd say August 1940. It might be earlier, but the moment you get a force and get it worked up is August 1940. So by November 1940, you can be really well worked up. Now, here's the thing. Taranto might not have happened on November. It was scheduled to happen earlier. It didn't happen earlier because of the issues with Illustrious and the issues with Eagle. And the issues with Eagle meant Illustrious only went historically. Now the thing is, if you've had free carriers, you've been able to operate those carriers at a slightly less of a fever pitch and actually do more proper maintenance and not push them so hard, you probably have all free carriers available, and maybe slightly earlier in November. It might even take place in October. There was a consideration of a certain night in October. And of course, I'm speaking of the very special 21st of October. Trafalgar. Now, why does that matter? Why would the 21st of October matter and be useful? Well, A, there's historical significance, and the Japanese do like that. But in terms of the full history of it, for the British, it's useful as well. For the British, it adds added history to the moment of Taranto. And, yeah, the Italian ships are there. So, you could get this in November 1940, you could get it in October 1940. And the scenario you have, very likely, if this takes place in October, is even more availability of aircraft. But even if it takes place in November, it's more availability of aircraft. Now, one of the reasons I see them delaying to November is if Roosevelt gets his early through plan. Now, here's the scenario. You would have 4 Gloucester Sea Gladiators. You would have 15 Fulmars and 21 Zeros. And if the Americans are also along for the fun, well, then you'd have potentially 18 Brewster Buffaloes. Which is a kind of a different scenario from the fighters you have traditionally at Taranto, in terms of the Royal Navy strength. You have 18 Aki, D3A, Val, dive bombers. If just the Japanese are along, and this is just the Soryu. Potentially, you'd have 36 Helldivers if you also have Enterprise or Yorktown. My temptation is probably... You see, I really like the idea of Enterprise, Ark Royal, and Hiryu forming a Force H team up and just smashing the world to pieces, because I just think that sounds cool. But I also think Enterprise being at Taranto would sound pretty good, so you can pick which one you prefer to be there. There is a part of me which has designed this air group around what Yorktown's air group do at the time, I must admit. And you'd have 18 Kate, Nakajima B5Ns, and 36 Swordfish, plus potentially 18 Douglas Devastators. Now here's the thing. What's likely to happen in this scenario? Well, in this scenario, you get the British attacking at night. The British will still do a night strike. It will be with the 36 Swordfish. It will probably be with some of the Fulmars providing rocket attack, some of the sort of attacks with bombs, etc. To take on, probably doing the flare jobs definitely instead of the Swordfish, so that they don't have to, and to maximize their capability for a torpedo strike. You don't have to be quite as careful with the Fulmars as you have so many more fighters available. You can afford to risk a couple and still have your group. And I don't think the Americans turn up and night whatever happens. I think the British do a night strike. And then I think you get a dawn strike. Now, the interesting thing, the British might join in that. They might not. I could see the British loaning some extra fulmars to that, especially if they've used a couple the night before. They could add some more fulmars into the strike to assist with that, and maybe no swordfish because of the day strike. And the Japanese going for the day strike. They would go in first thing at dawn. So pretty much you'd have the dawn strike from the Japanese after a night strike by the British. Now, if the Americans are also there, then it's a American-Japanese dawn strike. Either way, under this scenario, I do not see much of the Italian fleet surviving in an operational form. The Battle of Taranto, of course, historically, led to 3 battleships being disabled, of which some were repaired and brought back into service, a heavy cruiser damaged, 2 destroyers damaged, and 2 fighters destroyed, and that was achieved with 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers, of which not all of them were carrying torpedoes. Some were carrying flares, some were carrying bombs, and only a few were carrying torpedoes. You have more torpedo bombers, i.e. more carrying torpedoes going in at night. You have a dawn strike when the Italians are trying to get everyone out to sea and trying to get the ones which are able to float around out of the harbour as quickly as possible. When they're in that level of disorder, I think you lose a lot of ships. I think they get very, very heavily damaged. And I think, as a result, the Italian fleet is going to be knocked back severely. When they left this, they had 2 working capital ships, realistically, after this, and that does lead to some very interesting operations. But without that, and I would say again, they have 6 battleships sitting in harbour. If all 6 are to an extent knocked out and damaged, and they have to take months to repair any of them they can get available, historically they don't manage to repair all the ones which are damaged, and if you do more damage they're going to be even more of a trouble. You are pretty much knocking out the Italian heavy fleet units for a good year as a fighting force. Now, I know the American torpedo bombers are using the Mark 13 torpedo. I know that. But still, if you have 18 of their Devastators with them, and 18 Nakajima B5 and Kate, so you've got 36 torpedo bombers, and I know the Japanese torpedoes aren't great, but again, harbour attacks versus sea attacks. They are oriented around sea attacks. Harbour attacks are where they have issues, but Mediterranean, they probably in that area have enough depth. Backed up by perhaps 54 dive bombers and some fighters providing top cover against whatever the Regia Aeronautica throws in dawn. Ooh. Anything that's still floating out, and if the Royal Navy's gone up by 15 Swordfish, I do not consider outrageous to reckon that it's 4 damaged rather than 3. I still think Guido Cesare avoids it, but those 2 ships trying to navigate around their 4 damaged sisters and trying to get out to sea, that's going to be slow maneuvering, that's going to be difficult maneuvering. Under attack, that's going to damage them. And the 4 stationary ships which are damaged, you're just hitting them for the sake of hitting them. You're just going to compound whatever damage they've sustained, and make worse any scenario they've had to do in terms of damage control. So yes, I think whether you have Soryu on her own, or you have Soryu and a Yorktown launching this attack, I honestly do not see the Italian fleet being heavy units being a factor of operations for at least the next 12 to 18 months. Even if by some miracle the blessed Giulio Cesare, the vessel which seems to have almost divine protection of it, survives. It's one old battleship. You're not going to be able to cover a reinforcement of Crete. You're not going to be able to cover the deployment of the North Africa Corps. You're not going to be able to cover any operations against Malta or something like that with one battleship against the likely forces you're going to be having to deal with. And cruisers are probably going to get damaged and other things will get damaged. This will be I wouldn't like to say a mortal blow to Italy, but it could be a very wounding blow to the regime of Mussolini. I can honestly see Mussolini having real trouble with this one, because he's Minister of the Navy. He's also Minister of the Air Force. He cannot avoid this one. With Taranto as it was, he could claim it was a surprise, not that, all sorts of things, and he managed to recover from it fairly quickly. And have ships out. And have them doing good things that got him back status and, signs of success. He's just lost a lot of his value to both his country, in his authority as a leader, and to his ally. A lot of his value. And that's going to have an impact on his relationships. And that's then going to have a knock-on impact on the wider Mediterranean conflict and the North Africa campaign. If you have got the British able to push forward as they were historically, without the Italians able to get supplies through. If you've got maybe no invasion of Greece, or if they do try and invade Greece, well, the Allies have complete control of the sea. And again, maybe when the Japanese troops show up, instead of taking them, they either replace the troops being taken out of North Africa so that they don't lose the momentum in North Africa to supply the forces of Greece, or maybe the Japanese troops go to Greece. Maybe that's where the Japanese soldiers go. Maybe the Japanese and Australian soldiers go to Greece. There are all sorts of options of what could happen and what forces could be deployed where. You freed up a lot of committed assets with this scenario. And yes, it's going to take time to redeploy them, but once you're at November 1940, December 1940, that's 6 months. Things have started to move. Things will be in place. And the trouble is, if the Italians have lost their battle fleet, then that's going to change the needs of the British in terms of commitments, in terms of capital ships to the Mediterranean itself, but also other commitments to the Mediterranean. Now, if the Italians are down to Giulio Cesare operating there, then you might swap out the Queen Elizabeths for the R-class and take them home to reinforce the home fleet. Maybe you leave one of them. Let's say Queen Elizabeth. She's a modernised Queen Elizabeth class. Give her a couple of R's as backup. That's plenty of battle line for dealing with the Giulio Cesare. And if Roma comes out, well, you've got carriers there. But why are you concentrating this battle forces in the home fleet area? Well, if you want to have strength there, if you want to have capability to deal with the Germans coming out when you can't control them, Mediterranean you can control because you can seal either end. They can't go anywhere. The Germans can get into the North Atlantic. That's a problem. The Germans can get up the coast of Norway, and they can maybe make to ports in France, which they of course did historically, and the British are already thinking about that. So yeah, you need to have reinforcements up there. You need to have forces available. And let's say the Queen Elizabeth class, what can you use them for? Do you want to use them chasing ship? No. but you might use them as blocking assets. You can't chase the Bismarck with them, but you can stick them in areas where they block the Bismarck with forces around them. In terms of, oh, there are battleships sitting there. Can we deploy through that area? Well, we can go very fast, but either way, we're going to end up in their gunnery range. That's not a good idea. 2 or 3, let's say, Warspite and Valiant sitting there. Modernized Queen Elizabeth class. Can you win with them against them? You might think you can. Can you win against them without getting damaged so much that you're going to be easy prey for whatever comes next? The odds are not in your favour. The odds will ever not be in your favour on that front. Which does bring us succinctly to the historical history, the historical activities. Traditionally, the twins go hunting in January 1941. Well, if you've, let's say, got Warspite, Valiant, Nagato, Mutsu reinforcing, along with Nelson and Rodney, reinforcing the home fleet as the 6, let's say, slow but don't want to fight heavies, and you've got 3 Congos and Hood and Prince of Wales and Prince of Wales and King George V. You have got a fairly capable fast force to draw from. So much so you might send Hood for a refit. You might be refitting ships and maintaining them as you historically had planned. And as a fallback, Force H has got Renown. It may it probably has, as I've said before, Haruna. It could well have Hiryu by this point, as well as Ark Royal. That's a fast force which is going to be in the mid-Atlantic very quickly, causing you trouble if you're hunting. And especially as they don't have to worry so much about the Italians. They might even have been redeployed. They might be reinforcing the northern approach as well, and it might be that some of the slow battleships have taken over Force H. It could be Nelson and Rodney are now Force H, backing out with Furious and Eagle as their supporting carriers. After all, you can leave the Eastern Mediterranean in the warm embrace of Illustrious and the Soryu quite happily. Especially if the Italians aren't going to be able to support operations for Crete and Malta, for Crete, or possibly even the invasion of Greece. If they do launch the invasion of Greece, they're not going to be able to go for Crete because they're not going to be able to provide them with amphibious support, which means you're not going to have to do the evacuation of Crete, which means you get that as an aircraft carrier. This is all going to be an issue for anyone trying to attack British ships in the Mediterranean, or Allied ships in the Mediterranean. I would be tempted to say, I think that if I was the Germans under this circumstance, I would not send Scharnhorst and Eisenhower out hunting in January 1941. I would hold them till May. I would be wanting to send out the strongest possible force to go and face anything of that magnitude. If I'm going to send anything out at all, I might not. I might not send anything out. Why? Because anything I send out, I'm sending into an absolute maelstrom of forces. If Renown and Hiryu and Akagi and Kongo, Hei, Kuroshima, All the fast ships sitting up there are up there and operating. Victorious will be available. Possibly Formidable as well, because, well, traditionally she replaces Illustrious, but she might be there. She might go reinforce Illustrious and Soryu in the Eastern Mediterranean for them to do further operations. Honestly, the reality becomes very quickly, if you've got able to secure Malta and Crete doesn't fall, and you don't maybe have to fight Greece, but if Greece does fall, if the Italians do invade Greece, remember they get held up until the Germans join them. Well, does Mussolini attack Greece? And especially does he do it if North Africa falls? Because North Africa could fall in this scenario, because you can very quickly block off the North Africa supply routes if you don't have to worry about the heavy forces interfering with the action of your destroyers and your cruisers. You can send light cruisers and destroyers to go happy hunting. And let's be honest, the Japanese and the Royal Navy, Imperial Japanese Navy and Royal Navy's destroyer crews and light cruiser crews will absolutely adore any instruction which involves them to go doing happy hunting along the coast of North Africa. Along with submarines interdicting supplies and the army reinforced pushing up, North Africa could fall very quickly. You could be talking February, March 1941. North Africa could be completely over and done. And that could have interesting connotations for the Vichy French. Because if you haven't got Germans pulling back and trying to use Vichy French ports, etc., French North Africa might also change hands at a similar point and might allow the change of leadership from Charles de Gaulle to someone who Churchill doesn't find quite so onerous. You never know. Churchill might have a knock of good luck. But I honestly think any scenario which has this going this far, if Germany does send its fleet out, they're not going to be running into pairs of ships. They're going to be running into fours. And if I'm putting that together into this scenario, I'm probably looking at 2 Congos and 2 British fast ships, which probably results in King George V repulse a couple of Congos and Prince of Wales renown on a couple of Congos, being your 2 groups, and each group given a fast carrier to back them up, which is going to change the entire scenario. And if HMS Hood is not in her refit, then expect her to be part of that. Maybe they form 3 groups of 3 and each with a fast carrier. After all, they have Victorious, they have potentially Indomitable, they have Soryu, Ark Royal, Akagi. They kind of have an abundance to pick from in that scenario. And so you could well have 3 forces with each with a carrier out hunting. Now, it might not be that similar, because I think if you go with 2 groups of 4, you've got the British for the night operations, and I don't think, whilst I'm sure the Japanese will be stressing everything they can to get good at night operations after seeing the British do what they did at Taranto, I don't think they're going to manage to jump into them dramatically in wartime. They haven't got the structure of training of their air groups and their air personnel to be able to do that quickly, as skilled as their pilots and aviators are. So you end up possibly with each set of 4 also having a Japanese carrier and a British carrier with them to do the night strikes. British carrier does the night strikes and night reconnaissance. Japanese carrier leads the day strikes and some of the day reconnaissance. And again, I did point out Queen Elizabeth classes and other large battleships coming back. What would they be doing? They'd be providing security of key areas to free up your fleet for moving, and security of key convoys. Again, you could have, let's say, operating from Iceland, you could have HMS Warspite and HMS Valiant operating out of Iceland. You could be supporting them from there. In which case, they could make various straits a very dangerous place to be. And they could be there to assist things. Now, this situation only gets worse if you add the Americans into it. If you add what the Americans potentially have available and could potentially have brought along, that makes the situation dramatically worse for the Germans. Even a greater preponderance of force could be brought to bear. You could well have 3 squadrons of 4 capital ships wandering around. And yes, you can do the maths if you want, and I am sure there are scenarios, let's be honest, on the maths on the tabletop. Most of the time, Hood and Prince of Wales should win that fight versus Bismarck and Prince Eugen. It's a 1 in a million shot, which doesn't take away from their accuracy and their capabilities. It just makes it more amazing in some regards. That takes out Hood because of where it hits. And as I said, I do subscribe to the Drakenfell theory of going through that trough. It just all fits up so well. It's scary. But if someone makes a better argument, I will listen to it. But at the moment, I'm going with that. And if you add that all together, well, you know, they could still have that chance, but that was versus 2. And yes, they might have 3 in this scenario, but they could be against 4 capital ships and probably a more senior commander. And if the British are being really clever, one of those forces is led by a British admiral, one of those forces is led by a Japanese admiral, and one of those forces, if there's a third force in the Americans there, is led by an American admiral. And there's probably a British, and you might well find Hood is back from refit by the time they come back, because she's been able to go to refit because the twins didn't come out and all those things, or is back from a refit, and there is a senior commander already out there in charge from her, using her as his flagship to wander between the forces. The British overall commander of the combined forces. They could also have a scenario where it's a British, I would say with any force structure, what they'd have is they'd have British deputy commander, British deputy commander, the Japanese commander, Japanese deputy commander, British commander, and the Americans and British would work it out. Probably American commander and British deputy commander, if have that scenario. So you could have all of them balanced. The British holding the force together. It could work. It could be really interesting. So what do I predict of any battle? Well, any battle if it happens, is going to involve probably airstrikes first, followed up by more airstrikes, followed up by a surface action. It's not a good day to be the Kriegsmarine at sea. It really isn't. I think I called them the Reichsmarine earlier, but they were for most of the 1920s and 30s. So I'm going to let myself get away with that one if I've left it in there. But the Kriegsmarine are not going to be having a good time. They really aren't. And so, what does this all lead to the course of World War II? The question comes down to, if America doesn't join, you still have an overwhelming preponderance of force, and probably American supplies. What happens to Mussolini? If he loses North Africa and has lost a fleet, whilst yes, there has been no invasion of Italy, if he launches also the Greek invasion, and that goes as it did historically, i.e. badly until the Germans come in, I think he might lose his position. He is not as secure as Hitler is, by any stretch of the imagination. And I think those 3 losses combined could be enough to get him down without him necessarily facing the thing of actually Allied invasion of Italy. I think they could do that before. Now, the reason I say this is because Italy does have a habit of changing sides when they think it's not in their favour to stay on the side they are. And it could well be that the monarch and the royalist faction in Italian politics decide that if they do this, then they can use their monarchy to act as a good communicator with the British and the Japanese and say, yes, we have managed, thanks to your assistance and thanks to you managing to take away the loyalists of that foul regime, we have managed to research traditional monocracy, i.e., a constitutional monarchy democracy. And yes, I would like to now join my brother monarchs in leading in this war against these dictators. I'd like to change sides. As Germany wouldn't have significant troops in Italy at this point, that could happen very quickly. Or alternatively, they could declare themselves neutral. They could declare themselves neutral, in which case Germany doesn't have a reason to invade Greece anyway. I'd say it's a toss-up either way. I think initially they would probably go for neutrality, but that's going to depend how accepting Britain and Japan are of neutrality. If they do go for neutrality early enough in 1941, i.e., before about the same time as the historic invasion of Greece, that of course even frees up even more forces from the Mediterranean to go to help with the blockade of the German surface raiders, and also the submarine hunting and other operations going on. If that happens, I do not see the Germans going out. I see them doing a fleet in being scenario, and I see a series of carrier raids attacking those ships in being and trying to take them out. The question becomes, at this point, what does Hitler do? Hitler could try and bunker down and hold on to what he's got, but even a neutral Italy could be problematic because it means the south of France is open. And an invasion of the south of France with Free French forces and British forces and British Empire forces and Japanese forces could well make its way up through France, with France quickly switching sides as it goes, and and could catch them and could cause him trouble, and he could have to defend it. But taking the whole of France will, of course, lead to the sinking of the fleet at Toulon and various other things, and also gives him a lot of extra land he has to control and administer. Added to that, you have the scenarios, or the very real scenarios, and very real fears of what exactly you do in any scenario to reinforce that. Railways are not exactly succinct lines of communication logistics to that front. Norway is probably not going to get invaded because, let's be honest, invading Norway is a nightmare. The fact that the Germans pull it off is mostly due to the Norwegian government being asleep at the wheel and ineffective as rather than the actual Germans being any good at amphibious warfare. I'm sorry, but that whole plan is an absolute Hail Mary, and the fact it takes off is something which is kudos and a feather in the cap of the Germans, but it is more the Norwegians to lose. Using the radio rather than a telegram to warn people, actively supporting their naval officers in their positioning, having their reserves called up so that if there are any officers who do demur about what they're supposed to do, everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, so they suddenly find themselves dealing with their deputy pointing their gun at them and reminding them of their duty, or reminding them or introducing them to a lead, will have a salutary effect. So leaving that to one side, the war's going to be interesting. There is an avenue, there is a route for the Allies to go where they would face almost no naval opposition. Going to the south of France, they're not going to face any naval opposition at all. you might face air opposition, but if Italy's knocked out of the war, you don't face that. If Italy is still in the war, then he's got the Italian troops, but he's got no North Africa commitments. He's maybe taken Greece, but won't have taken Crete, in which case bombers are in range of his oil field, of their oil fields. And possibly that pushes him to launch Operation Barbarossa to try and seize Stalin's oil fields. At which point he ends up fighting a war against Stalin as well. Now, I think if he does that, and we are now getting far beyond where you can reasonably predict in alternate history phrases, you're now well into 1942 and the war has changed sufficiently that it is almost obscene. Without North Africa, without the Far East to shore up, without all of those issues, and with the ability to invade through the south of France or Italy, I think the Allies do launch the Allies, as they were or as they are at this point, launch an operation in 1942. I also think that there will have been an incident in 1942, if there's not one in 1941, between the neutrality patrols and the Germans. They were getting pretty hectic already in 1941. With this added pressure, they're going to be pushing harder. If they push harder, they can get in more trouble. If in 1942 it happens, then yeah, I think at some point in 1942, latest, the Americans join, if they're not already part of it. At which point, how long does the war last? Well, if Hitler does invade the Soviet Union in 1941, and the Allies then invade Europe in late 1941, as whatever they are, I honestly don't give him that long. Again, you can resupply the Soviet Union in the Far East, you can resupply them for Iran, you can resupply them. Arctic convoys are going to be different than they were historically. You have a lot more assets to support and sustain them. You have a lot more carriers to support and sustain them. And honestly, I don't see a PQ-17 scenario happening. Because if you have enough carriers that you can deploy 2 or 3 carriers with 2 or 3 capital ships or more in a task force to be the heavy covering force, there is not much that can be based on and sustained in Norway that can be a sufficient enough threat for that force to feel they have to turn back. And yes, that's putting them in the threat of submarines, but again, that's a lot more aircraft and a lot more assets and a lot more capability in that force to deal with that threat. I'd say war is over in 1943 at some point. I would honestly say that. And I would say the biggest decider in that scenario is going to be not just the blockade, not just naval forces' ability to move things around, but I would say heavy bombers from Crete ripping apart the oil fields in Romania are going to be a massive killjoy for the Germans when it comes to operations. And I would say, if I was being the British and doing that at that time, I would wait till January 1941. No, January 1942. Sorry. I'd let the Germans invade in 1941. I know that's bad of me, but if they're going to invade, they're going to invade anyway. And I'd wait till winter's about to get to its nastiest, when their fuel reserves are heading down their lowest, when they are at their maximum stretch logistically wise, and I would blow out of their fuel production. I would turn their oil fields to sunder. It's going to take a lot of bombers launching from Crete, but you've got time to set it up. You've got infrastructure to put that in place. you are able to do that, especially with the Italian Navy knocked out. You could probably have the ships carrying necessary aircraft and supplies thread along the north coast of Africa. Quietly threading along. They might even spend every night in port, so they don't have to deal with the threat of submarines during the night. So they can just deal with the submarine threat during the day when they can see periscopes quite easily. Or maybe they go around Africa and come up from Alexandria. That's a even safer route, and there's nothing you can do about that. And launching the bombers from there, take out the oil supplies, cut the German and their allies, the Axis forces, off in Russia. Let the Russians then do what they feel like doing, whilst your own forces advance and engage. And launch your basically hit the oil at that point, and then invade March 1942, south of France. March up France. Why not Italy? Why not the boot of Italy? Why not Sicily? Because honestly, if Italy is neutral at this point, you don't need to, you don't want to. If Italy is still involved in the war, their forces are going to be stretched out in the Soviet Union as well. Landing in France probably finishes off Mussolini, if the rest hasn't. That's a calculation to go with. But that is all a very long-range projection, and a lot of things have changed at that point. Summary: does it stop war with America? Who knows? That's going to depend on how America resolves things. If America does become an ally and they're fighting alongside the Japanese, that might build relationships which could potentially ward off conflict. It could also have the effect, especially of the Japanese, if they're fighting, the ground force are fighting alongside each other, them and the British and the Americans. It could force them to think, hang on, these people fight like demons. As well. They're tough fighters as well. That could change some of their analysis of fighting against them. They might still get themselves backed into a corner strategically and mentally, and they might still allow themselves to be so, but hopefully they don't. Hopefully they don't. I always finish these videos with a question. Today's question is quite a simple one, realistically. I outlined forces involved that would likely be involved in any sort of repeat of a German breakout, i.e. Operation Rheinberg scenario, Operation Berlin scenario combined, really. Let's say the Germans hold their forces, get the Graf Zeppelin ready, actually do get her ready, after seeing Taranto and the other things, and along with Tirpitz, Bismarck, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Graf Zeppelin, they decide to launch a force out which can match the forces the Allies are moving around, in a scenario where it's just Italy, just Japan and Britain. America hasn't yet joined. So let's go for later 1941. I doubt, I honestly think that if America doesn't join in 1940, they will join at some point in 1941. But, if we go for, let's say, they really pushed August 1941. All these forces are ready. What do you think happens? What do you think the results are like? if you have got Hiryu and Ark Royal operating in one group, and Akagi and Victorious operating together in another group, another pair, and you've got, as said, a King George V and a Renown class with each pair in each group, and a couple of Congos in each group. The Germans have the advantage, certainly, in force strength. So much so that I would presume the heavy units, whether they be Nelson and Rodney, because, you know, I said I put them down at Force H. I thought they'd probably replace there as the blocking force there, but they might not. They might be involved. A Queen Elizabeth class, NERs, any other available ships, and of course Mutsu and her sister Nagato. You've got some heavy units there that can be available. What do you think they do? What do you think happens? Do they have a scenario with the carriers that, with the information they're able to receive, the British are able to combine forces? So the Germans end up running into a force which is 4 carriers and 8 capital ships, and maybe other reinforcement, and maybe Hood come up as flagship. Potentially Duke of York as well. That would be an interesting scenario. I'm mentally going through it and thinking 3 Duke of Yorks, Hood, Renown, Repulse, and 4 Congos. That's not a force I would particularly like to take on if I was the Germans in that scenario. But they have 4 fast battleships. They have the edge. And that they are battleships, they're built as battleships. But I'd like to hear your ideas of what you think might have happened in that scenario. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you like these Patreon suggestions. If you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. That really does help the channel grow, and that's a really important thing for me because I have a competition running between my mother and my aunt, which is a bet which I hope to finally get off my back. But also, I am trying to make more a thing of the YouTube channel. I really do want to grow it because I like the outreach, I like the interaction I have with people about naval history, and I think answering these questions allows us to explore a lot of the history. A lot of decisions are not taken because sometimes there is strategy, sometimes there is resources just not available, and sometimes there's the reality of the situation. It's like there are lots of scenarios where the British would have loved to hit those Romanian oil fields, but they didn't have airfields in the range. And one of the reasons they didn't have the airfields in the range is they didn't have enough to secure the Mediterranean early enough to hit the Italians hard, the Reggio Marina hard enough to knock it out. And one of the reasons they don't have the forces to do that is because they have forces off focusing and watching the Japanese. So you ripple through the history. It's not much more force. It's not many more forces. It's not much more force required to do that. But it has an impact. What have we got coming up? Well, next week is American World War II Carrier Naval Aviation. Doctrine, pre-war, to war. That's going to be a fun Tuesday video. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And when you see this video, there is still a few hours left, because it will be Sunday, in 24 hours' time, that the Patreon vote will be over for July. And remember, for July, it's going to be the 4 highest receiving topics, the 4 topics which are most votes, which are being turned into premieres, because I'm hoping to be, that's for June, I mean, not July. And it's also going to be repeated in July, because I'm moving house, setting up things, and so I'm going to try, and I'm going to guarantee the Sunday brew ships as much as I can when I'm traveling around and whatever I'm doing. But I'm basically going, June might be an absolute nightmare, because I'm also going to be sorting out this place solo after we've moved. I have to get this place ready for sale, so it's going to be just a tad bit of work. Just a tad. Thank you very much for all your support. Thank you very much for all your kind words. Thank you very much for all the Patreon, the super chats, the super thanks, all those things, the Ko-fis. They make a massive difference as well. Hope you enjoyed the video, and take care.